An Oakland firefighter battalion chief James Riley saved dozens of lives, including that of KTVU reporter Rob Roth and his photographer, after he was trapped covering the flames along with Nick Suarez, who was shooting that day. Rob describes this day as the worst day of his life, but also the luckiest.
This was the actual beginning of the fire. The day before, Saturday afternoon, October 19th. Cameraman Nick Suarez and I were on our way to the Cal-Washington football game when we saw fire engines racing into the hills. We followed.
The other inch and a half on the top of one extend this line.
There were no winds that day, and that helped keep the fire from getting any worse. A helicopter hit a bullseye, and the fire appeared out. No damage done. At the time, it all seemed barely worth mentioning. The next morning, Sunday, Nick and I found firefighters combing the canyon looking for hot spots. But I had something else on my mind. This was also the due date for my wife's and my first baby. I was hoping to finish early in case she went into labor. By 10 a.m. it was getting windy out on the canyon. Another fire crew was dealing with a minor flare-up down the canyon on Buckingham Boulevard. You could see flames poking up, but it didn't look like anything the firefighters couldn't handle. But in what seemed an instant, everything changed. Wind seemed to come in from all directions at once. Strong wind, swirling wind, the kind that blows sand and dust in your eyes. On the canyon, the wind acted like someone was pouring gasoline from the sky. And then came that sound, the relentless rumble of 1,000 bass drums. You could not hear anything above that sound, and it is my most vivid memory of that day. By 11 o'clock, smoke began turning day into night. A wall of smoke had sealed off everything to our right, including our car. The fire, in full rage, was stretching out to our left. Behind us was a sheer drop. And with that sound at full blast, the smoke and fire was tumbling down toward us, and it was getting hotter. Nick and I looked at each other. We've never spoken to one another about this part, but in that look, we both came to the same realization. There was no way out. I remember saying to myself, this can't really be happening, not on the day my baby is due. At that moment, a small fire truck with 4 firefighters came out of the smoke looking like Bogart in the last scene of Casablanca. A battalion chief said, "Hop on." We would learn later these were the last human beings to make it out in this direction that day. The firefighters began evacuating people along the hillside. A minute or so after we got on the truck, the man who invited us to hop on got off to help some frightened residents. We never saw Battalion Chief James Riley again.
Anybody find Riley?
That night, police found the body of James Riley near the body of a woman he was trying to save. That was his car. Nick and I finally hooked up with a Channel 2 crew and began filing live reports from the burning hills. Leslie, we're at the intersection of Glenbrook and Bowling in the Oakland Hills, and you can see both of us were feeling sick from swallowing so much smoke, but we were alive. 8 days later, firefighters from throughout California attended the funeral of James Riley, a man everyone describes as simply a great guy. Even though I only knew him for a minute and never spoke to him, I wanted to go, but I couldn't.
Joining us now to talk about his experience 30 years later is Rob Roth. First of all, I'm glad you're here because things could have been very different. When we leave the shop as reporters, you know, you never know what's going to happen. Your first story, I guess, was you were going to the Cal game, right? And then you went up to the hills.
Yeah, that's right. First, let me just sort of put an end to the story here. The reason that I couldn't go to Chief Riley's funeral was on that very day, my wife gave birth to a beautiful baby girl, Casey. And to this day, 30 years later, I'm just forever grateful.
Casey's 30 now.
Casey is 30. And I'm just grateful that I was able to be there when she was born.
I mean, I watched the package, your story earlier, and it's like I was cutting onions, you know. I was getting a little emotional, and I wasn't even there. I do remember your reporting that day. Tell me more about how you feel 30 years later after surviving that, but also seeing all the devastation.
Well, it gave me a tremendous understanding of what people in crisis go through. You know, when I left my home that day, I had no idea, you know, I'd be in this sort of life or death situation. And even when we got there to the fire on that Sunday, which is tomorrow would be the 30-year anniversary of that, when we first got there, we had no idea that this was going to blow up. Usually, as reporters, when fires happen, we're on the outside trying to get in. As it so happens, this time I was on the inside trying to get out, and that's a whole different perspective. But it was so chaotic. The wildfires are loud. That's one thing that I learned, and you can't even hear yourself think. And even though my photographer was a foot away from me, we had trouble even hearing one another. And we really didn't know what to do at some point. No one was around, and then this fire truck that I described just luckily just came out of the smoke and told us to hop on.
Do you think this is a story as a reporter that affected you the most? In other words, when you think of your life, you've been on the job now for a long time. This has to be one of the ones that affected you personally, because you almost didn't make it to the birth of your daughter.
Yeah, I was in my 30s when that happened, and you sort of want to, you hope for a swashbuckling story to be able to tell your grandchildren about your days in the reporting field. But it's careful what you wish for. Yeah, it's for sure. It's changed my life. I have tremendous empathy for people who lose their homes in firefighters, in wildfires, and I've covered wildfires since then, and I'm always my heart always races when I hear the escape stories of people trying to get out, and that's what affects me most. It's just so frightening because you just don't really know what to do. You don't know around the corner if a tree is going to fall and block the road, and then what do you do? I mean, there's just millions of different decisions you have to make, and I have just tremendous sympathy and empathy for people who go through that.
30 years later, we lost our news director, Fred Zender, who was the news director that day. And what did he tell you after you came out? I mean, I almost longed to hear the words of Fred that day. Did he say anything to you? Did he say anything about our coverage? Did he say, I'm glad you made it out? What did he say?
Well, it was very busy in the newsroom. It was very chaotic, and we had other reporters out. And it's breaking news, so you don't really know exactly what's going on.
Maybe what did he say after everything?
Yeah, well, he came over to me and he told me, that I'd done a good job, which, from Fred, that meant the
That's
the
all
world
he
to
said.
me.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he also said, just kind of to soak it all in, to take it in, because this kind of experience most likely will never happen again, and he was certainly right about that. So he kind of wanted me to sort of understand at that point in my career what we just witnessed.
Well, Rob, thank you for joining us. I know it could be a little emotional for you,
Yes.
How close you came, but you're here with us. You've been with us for a long time with your experience, and thanks for joining us this morning to talk about it.
Well, thank you, Sal. Much appreciated.
Mornings on 2, we'll be right back.